Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. Please use the chat feature option to let us know where you're joining us from so we can get a better understanding of where our audiences are coming from. In about 1 or 2 minutes time, we will begin this webinar, but for now, please let us know where you're joining us from. Apopka, Escambia, Hillsborough County, Pasco, Taylor, Osceola, Volusia County, Broward County, quite a few Broward County participants here today. Miami and South Florida, Palm Beach. So we have representation from the Panhandle, the Central Florida regions, as well as the South, Sarasota, Indian River, Madison, Lake Worth. That is fantastic. Rebecca was just telling us we have nearly about 500 registered participants, so we are expecting this webinar to be highly, highly attended throughout the state. Sometimes we even have attendees and participants even beyond the state of Florida. So that is a fantastic uh, opportunity for all of us to learn on what we have in store for you today. So, for the sake of time, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Um, Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar. My name is Mark Celestin, and I am the training coordinator for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. We are excited to host you this morning for this professional webinar. Your microphones have been muted. We will be closing the chat feature during the presentation. Please put your questions into the Q&A section, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. So please save your questions for later. This webinar is approved for 1 FFLCP, LIAF, FDAX, DBPR, and FNGLA. But please note there are some delays in reference to the ISA and the CAM CEUs. So if you are in need of ISA or CAM CEUs, please reach out to me directly and I can provide a little bit more clarification in reference to those specifics. But everything else is currently approved all around. There is a $15 administration fee to receive a certificate for continuing education, CEUs. We will put the link in the chat box to make payment for the certificate if you have not already done so. You'll also see a survey invitation pop up. Please take a moment to complete it. It is very important as it is a tool that helps us shape future educational programs and better serve upcoming audiences. We will submit the CEUs for the licensing agencies on Friday. So please make sure to finalize your CEU payments by the end of the day today. If you would like CEU credits for your attendance, this is a part of a monthly webinar series that is held on the second Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Our next regularly scheduled webinar will be on July 14th with guest speaker Jamie Lynn Daugherty, who will be presenting on a topic wrangling roots, management, and consideration regarding tree roots in urban settings. So please mark your calendars. But today, we're thrilled to have you join us for our webinar on the topic of developing a weed management plan presented by Dr. Chris Marble. Dr. Chris Marble is an associate professor of ornamental and landscape weed management in the Department of Environmental Horticulture at the University of Florida. Dr. Marble is a passionate horticulturalist and educator studying the growth and management of weeds and invasive plant species and landscapes and ornamental plant production. Dr. Marble's research program aims to develop new methods of weed control using an integrated approach combining both chemical and non-chemical treatments. As an instructor for pest management at the university, Dr. Marble focuses on teaching pest control professionals about the importance of identifying weed species before applying treatment. He also works with extension faculty and staff, growers, landscapers, homeowners, and other stakeholders to deliver the latest information on weed pests and provide the most effective, economical, and environmentally friendly methods of weed control in and around ornamental plants. So please, without further ado, we will now shift over to Dr. Chris Marble's presentation. Dr. Marble?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for tuning in this morning. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about developing a weed management plan for the landscape. And this is very timely because in Florida in the summertime, that's typically when people are battling weeds. That's when the weed control is the hardest to keep these weeds under control is during the summertime. So we're going to talk about specifically in non-turf areas of landscapes, which is the area that I work in and around ornamental plants where we don't have a lot of herbicide options. And so, especially selective herbicide options. And so integrated weed management is critical, combining a bunch of different methods, keeping those cultural practices, following the things like the FFL principles, and things like that to help with weed control and ornamental plant health. So we will go ahead and get started here. So the challenges of these areas that we're going to be discussing today, these landscape beds, we don't have a lot of herbicide options. Really, the reason for that is because it's mixed planting. So it's not uncommon to go to a landscape and see 50 different species or more, in a landscape bed, or throughout the entire landscape. And so, how do you pick one herbicide that's going to be safe on all those different plants? And you can't, in most cases. So you really need a variety of tactics. Um, there's really few or no new herbicides coming down the pipeline anytime soon. In ornamentals, we're going to get those herbicide options labeled for use in our areas after they've been approved for crop uses in those larger scale uses. The reason for that is, comparatively, we're very small acreage and we're very high liability. Landscape plants are very expensive and hard to test in relation to a monoculture type system like corn or cotton or something like that. And then we're in Florida where weeds come to grow. And I can tell you, as a weed scientist, there's no other better place, in the United States to be a weed scientist than in Florida. So weeds are a constant challenge. We hardly ever get, even up in North Florida, we hardly ever get these hard freezes to where a lot of these, even the summer weeds, are going to really get killed off. And this past winter was kind of an exception to that. But weeds are going to be a continual threat. So we have to figure out how to manage them using a more holistic approach from start to finish. And that's going to be the things that we talk about. And kind of how I've structured this presentation is first, I'm going to talk about some herbicide options, which are what typically when people are asking me questions, they're wanting to know, what's the best herbicide for this particular thing. But we're going to also go into non-chemical approaches that can be effective when used alone or combined with herbicides. And then I also have a section on kind of an emerging thing that's come up where I'm probably getting more questions than anything, and that's weed management in these non-turf ground covers. These native species like sunshine mimosa, frog fruit, and then things that we've had around for a while like perennial peanut and things. And I'll talk about some weed control tactics for use in those areas to get those species established. So kind of an overview objective of what we're going to be discussing and kind of how I approach weed management, in the landscape from a research perspective is developing herbicide strategies that you want to prevent resistance. So we don't want to rely too heavily on one herbicide or one tactic. We don't want to rely too heavily on one herbicide or just herbicides in general. And we want to reduce the total amount of herbicide that we're using and the total herbicide load, and then of course cost. And then optimizing mulch use and then other non-chemical tools. And then also in landscapes, you're going to have these unique situations. You're going to have, large ground cover areas that are covered in some invasive weed or invasive plant, or you have, dollar weed growing up around roses, or all these specific cases where they come up and there's no real clear answers. And so we need to come up with strategies for what we're going to do when these situations arise. Um, so this is a toolbox, and so this is what I tell people to think of when you're talking about herbicides for this first part of my presentation. Herbicides are tools. They're just a singular tool. You don't rely on any one tool to complete a job. You have to use a variety of tools. You have to use different tools at different times, and one herbicide is not going to solve all of your problems, and not even one or two herbicides are going to solve all of your problems. There's some tools that you might use more than others, but all of these are important and they all play a role. We also don't want to rely too heavily on herbicides. We want to use these non-chemical things too, and work on those cultural practices and things that can solve a lot of people's issues with weed control. Often get these questions where people have these horrible weed issues, and they're trying to get their management down. And then you start to ask questions and find out more information. And they're watering 4 times a week, and the amount of water is just way too much for this planting bed. And these planting beds are being watered just like the turf grass in other cases, or a variety of different situations. And so or they're just using, glyphosate is the only thing they're doing, spot treating with glyphosate occasionally when they see weeds and things. And so there's a lot of things improvements that you can make that can be implemented throughout the year to keep those weed problems from getting out of control, because weeds, they don't increase linearly. Like a lot of pests, they increase exponentially. And so we want to start clean and stay clean. So in landscape beds, glyphosate's kind of the standard. It's generally the most effective from a cost and efficacy standpoint for a lot of weeds. But a lot of companies are no longer using it, or it might be banned or limited by different municipalities, or customers don't want it. People are hesitant to use glyphosate. I'm not going to really get into the advantages and disadvantages and kind of the opinions on that matter in this presentation. That's a whole nother, topic area. But we're going to talk about some of the alternatives if people are interested in those. So the most common alternative is glufosinate. And so that's sold under trade names Finale, Cheetah, and then several other names. There's a lot of other non-selective alternatives that are kind of used in the same way, where they're just mixed up at a concentration and spot treated. But these are all contact action herbicides. And so that's an important to note. Glyphosate is systemic. So you typically with systemic herbicides, you're going to get more translocation. That herbicide is going to go down. And in, most cases, all things considered, you're going to get to the roots and give you more thorough control. A contact is only going to be effective on the part of that weed that the spray actually contacts. And so even, something like glufosinate, which is the primary alternative, it's primarily a contact herbicide, and then all these other options are strictly, contact things. And so with those for large weeds and perennial weeds, you're probably not going to get the same level of control. And this is what people mostly rely on, are these post-only herbicides. When I talk to more people, it's rare for someone to really have a pre-emergence herbicide program in there. One of the reasons is that people think that they don't want to use a lot of herbicides or limit their herbicides, so they just spot treat. But I'll show how there's been cases, and we have research to back it up, to where if you use pre-emergent herbicides, you can really reduce the total herbicide load over time, especially from a professional standpoint. So just to compare glyphosate and glufosinate, if you were using that as an alternative, so mobility or how it moves in the plant, glufosinate would be minimal, glyphosate would be excellent. Safety to ornamentals, glyphosate essentially none. Glufosinate, if you spray over the top of ornamentals with glufosinate, you're going to burn the stew out of a bunch of plants. That's the scientific way to say that, burn the stew out of plants. But you're going to cause a lot of injury. But because it's contact, if you make an application and you get some drift on a plant or hit a leaf or something, a lot of times that plant's going to recover just fine, especially woody, ornamentals. But with glyphosate, maybe not. Even if you hit bark, people think glyphosate only has to be sprayed on green tissues. If you spray the bark of a crepe myrtle a few times, you will get permanent damage to that plant in a lot of cases. Water needed in terms of application volume, glufosinate coverage of that weed with the spray is going to be more important. So you're not going to be able to treat as large of an area typically. So that has to do with the coverage that's required. Control of perennials, just in general, glyphosate will be good, great. Glufosinate will be more like moderate or good. Control of annuals, both of them are going to do a pretty good job of that. Neither one of them have any kind of residual control. So whatever you spray, if you miss any weeds or there's seeds that are going to be there, you have that seed bank there. Neither one of them are going to do anything to those seeds to prevent those seeds from coming up. Um, Here's just some examples of some alternatives that are available. Now, this is definitely not an extensive list. There's hundreds of these that are out there and available. I'm just mostly showing this just as examples, but these are some of the common ones that I encounter and get questions about. I have the active ingredient, an example of a trade name, signal word, which is important to note the signal word on some of these because if you have a limited landscape license, you have to use caution label products. And so some of these would be out of the running for that because a lot of these are warning or danger label products. Um, and then I also have whether they're OMRI certified or not. So if they're OMRI certified, Organic Materials Review Institute, that means that they're organic certified. So they're organic herbicides. And so that can be important when someone is trying to use an organic approach. I've talked to a lot of people that work for school boards and things, and they have contracts with big schools or playgrounds or something, and they're just trying to use reduced risk pesticides or organic only pesticides and things. And so some of these could come into play there. Um, but all these contact action herbicides work very quickly, can be effective. But if you're using these as an alternative to glyphosate, it's important to keep some things in mind, which is what I'll talk about on the next couple slides. So a big advantage of these is that they work very quickly. So there's some of those examples, and you can compare it to glyphosate and glufosinate, where you can't really tell any difference between those and the non-treated one day after treatment. And a lot of these, if it's a warm day in the summertime, you can spray them, and then 15, 20 minutes later, that weed was sprayed, and you have rapid desiccation of that foliage. You can tell, and you can see just an example of that on this slide. So acetic acid, that's a horticultural vinegar. Tons of different herbicides that are out there with different, acidic acid products, typically 20%. And then, the different companies will use different surfactants and things like that. But acts as a desiccant. You can see the pictures of the weeds here. So garden spurge, crabgrass, and bittercress. A lot of burn down early on. But then when you get to 4 weeks with these contact action herbicides, this is what you can often see is some recovery there because you're not getting the roots. And if you don't have, complete thorough coverage, the part of that weed that wasn't contacted is going to be unaffected essentially. And so we can come back and regrow. Um, so we looked at a lot of these and we looked at different application volumes and different rates, and we looked at 3 different species, spurge, oxalis, and crabgrass. And then we screened a bunch of these alternatives to see if there's any major differences in between all of these because they all work in a fairly similar way. They're all used in a fairly similar way. They're all contact products. And so we did this so that applicators could be able to select alternatives that work better for their situation. And so this is our results. So this is after 4 weeks after we applied the 1st treatment. I have the active ingredients down here. This is a visual rating, a percent control based upon the how the non-treated control looks. So if you get to 100, that means that essentially there was no green tissue left in those pots. And so you can see that at 4 weeks after treatment for all three of the weed species, glyphosate, is about providing 100% control of all three of those species. But we have pretty good control across the board 4 weeks after treatment. So that's really good. And there's not much difference between those different products. All of them, did as they were intended. They were all effective in burning those weeds down. But then you get to 8 weeks and you look at regrowth that occurred after that point. And when you get to that 5 to 6 week range after treatment, that's when a lot of these really start bouncing back. If you didn't get if they're large enough, essentially. And so you can see that those control ratings all went down in most of these products, and those weeds were able to regrow, especially at the larger growth stages that we treated. Um, and so when we average all those across the board, the one that was the most similar to glyphosate is the one that's the most common alternative, which is glufosinate. A lot of them provided acceptable control at those younger weed stages. So when we treated them when they were 2 or 3 inches tall, they all worked pretty well, and I would say they work similarly to glyphosate. But it's when those weeds become mature and they're flowering and they're going to seed, that's when you really see, long-term efficacy begin to drop off. And so the important thing to take away from this is that if you're using these and you're using these different alternatives, you'll typically have to make at least 2 applications to get the same control that you would expect to see with one application of something like a glyphosate. And we didn't see, if these things are used according to their label instructions, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between all the different products. And you're probably going to need repeated applications. And so we saw that was our kind of our hypothesis. And so we did another trial where we looked at 2 applications. So that second application was applied at about 4 weeks, right when we started to see that regrowth really start to occur. And in that case, we really knocked them back quite a bit, and you see great control across the board with those 2 applications, and most of those were similar to glyphosate with the 2 applications of those annual weed species. So that's the main takeaway there. These products are also going to be typically more expensive, so that's another thing to factor in also. You also have some, these synthetic selective alternatives as well. I think a lot of these herbicides are probably underutilized, and people rely too much on things like glyphosate and stuff like that to manage all of their weed issues. But a lot of these are out there that are available. We have these. Most of these have, at least some ornamentals where they can be applied over the top. So that will be important for things like ground covers or situations where plants are spaced really close together and you can't really make directed applications. So these first four herbicides are what we call graminicides. So they only affect grasses. They only control grassy weeds. These are generally very safe on all broadleaf plants or non-grass plants. So, something like a cethoxidin, which is sold as segment, or fluazepop, sulffusilade ornament. So those are options to selectively control grasses and a lot of different ornamental plants. Even those grasses that are coming up, through canopies of plants, they could potentially be used. You also have things like benazone, clopyralid. They can control some broadleaves, in some cases, selectively in other broadleaf plants. Launtrell or clopyralid's an option that people use a lot in junipers and ornamental grasses to control some broadleaf weeds. And then certainty and scepter, both of those are used commonly in turf grass. They'll control some broadleaf and some grassy weeds. Not really, I would consider broad spectrum herbicides, but they'll also control sedges very well. But they have, 20, 30, maybe 40 ornamentals on the label, including things like Asiatic jasmine, where they can be applied to those plants with no injury if if the label instructions are followed, of course. Um, and so with these over-the-top landscape herbicides that like were on the previous slide, you have typically, just 30 to 50 maybe plants that are on those label. It's not like they're broad spectrum and you can use them in all situations, but they can be useful in certain cases. Those graminicides, the ones that just control grasses, are the exception. Those might have 400 or 500 ornamentals on the label, and essentially they're pretty safe on anything that's not a true grass. So they can even be used on things like liriope or mondo grass and stuff like that that aren't true grasses. Um, but with pre-emergence herbicides. So that's what we haven't talked about, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit. But most of those have hundreds of plants on the label. You don't have to go over the top with those, but it can increase safety. That increases safety. If that herbicide is labeled for over-the-top use, you know that it's not going to cause injury if it's used as a directed application around the base of that plant. Um, not pre-emergent herbicides, but these selective post-emergent herbicides, they can come in useful in these special, specific situations. So, what you have here, you have looks like it's a holly, and then you have some torpedo grass that's growing up through the canopy of that. Torpedo grass, probably the worst invasive grass that we have in landscapes in Florida. And in this case, you don't see the torpedo grass in this area with no plants. And so, if I just looked at that, I would say, there's a good chance that whoever was treating that landscape was coming in there with glyphosate and they were spraying that torpedo grass out of those barriers and keeping that torpedo grass out of that. And so where did the torpedo grass go? It starts coming up in the canopy of those plants. So instead of glyphosate, you could come in with something like a fusilade, which is safe and hollies are on the label. Not going to be as effective as glyphosate, but you can apply it over the top of the holly. In this case, with something like torpedo grass coming up through the canopy of a shrub, you're not going to really be able to go in there and hand weed that out. You'd have to basically start over from scratch. But one of these graminicides, these selective options could be a case. This is skunk vine, which is a very bad invasive vine that you see in landscapes all the time, growing in and amongst juniper. Um, and then lawn trail or clopyralid could be an option in this case where it's got junipers on the label and it will be, an option for label for use in the landscape for skunk vine. You have some other selective alternatives that can be used in these areas, things like halosulfuron for sedges, and then sulfentrazone for sedge control, and they can be used around the base of plants. Um, but if you don't have any of these pre-emergent, if you're just using these post-emergent herbicides, I say you're always in correction or fire mode. And so if you actually go up and you add the number of applications that someone is making per year, the amount of times that they're actually spraying something when they don't have any pre-emergent herbicides in their program, it's oftentimes that they're using quite a bit of herbicides in those cases. You're always, putting out fires basically because you don't have any prevention in there. A lot of weed species that we deal with in the landscape are a lot easier to control with pre-emergence herbicides, things like annual grasses, artillery weed, and then a lot of others. And so the idea is to reduce those callbacks and those post-emergence applications by incorporating some pre-emergence herbicides into a program. So we wanted to look at this, and so we kind of hypothesized, and we said, I bet we could reduce, these spot treatments if we were to use a good pre-emergent herbicide in these cases. And so it's kind of put up or shut up, and so we wanted to prove it with a trial. And so in this case, we had three post-emergent herbicides: glyphosate, finale, and reward. Then we had glyphosate by itself. And then we included one of two pre-emergence herbicides in those applications. So we included Spectacle, which is indaziflam, or SureGuard, which is flumioxazin. And both of those are pretty broad spectrum pre-emergence herbicides. And so we included those with the post herbicide and we looked at the glyphosate alone. And so what we did was is we applied these treatments one time. Those pre-emergent herbicides were applied one time. Then every 2 weeks we would go back and we would rate those plots. If weed coverage exceeded 15% based upon our visual assessments, we would go in and make a spot treatment with glyphosate only. We didn't reapply those pre-emergent herbicides every time we treated. That would be off-label recommendation. So we just would go in, any of those treatments that exceeded 15%, we go in and spot treat with glyphosate. Every time that weed coverage exceeded 15%, LAC will be done in a typical landscape situation. And so this is 8 weeks after treatment, and you can see how those plots looked. So this has a spectacle in there, glyphosate plus spectacle, glyphosate plus flumioxazin, and then finale with those two, and then reward with those two. This is glyphosate by itself. And so this is what we would see. This is a really weedy area, a lot of weed pressure. It's getting too much irrigation in this case. But this is what we would see. We'd get great control post-emergence, and then by about 2 weeks, we start to see those seedlings popping back up if we just use glyphosate by itself. And so every 2, 3 weeks or so, we were exceeding that 15% mark, and we get high weed coverage and have to go back in and treat those if we didn't have the pre-emergence herbicide there. So this is the average control that we saw with those treatments over 12 weeks, and then the number of retreatments that we had to make in those different treatments. So, every time weed coverage exceeded 15%, we had to go back in and retreat. Glyphosate by itself, we had to make 4 reapplications in 12 weeks. So basically, on average, every 3 weeks, we're having to go in and spray. If we had Spectacle or SureGuard with glyphosate, if we just added one of those two products, one application, and we'd stay below 15% weed coverage throughout that entire period. And the same thing, with a lot of those other ones. Anytime we had that pre-emergence herbicide, we decreased the number of those spot treatments that were made. And then if you look at the total herbicide load that was actually applied, decreased that dramatically. Just some kind of takeaways from the trial. I'm not going to go through all this. But just to take away from this is that with the incorporating the pre-emergent herbicides, you can reduce the total herbicide load and reduce the total amount of pesticide that you're using. Oftentimes the number one pesticide that we're applying in landscapes is herbicides, especially when you're talking about spot treating. And so you can really take a step towards reducing the total pesticide load and cost by using just one, or 2 applications of pre-emergent herbicides a year and incorporating those. Now, I will point out too, I sound like I'm a big proponent of using pre-emergent herbicides. If you're dealing with perennial species, if you have a lot of nutsedge, dollarweed, torpedo grass, stuff like that, pre-emergent herbicides aren't going to do you a whole heck of a lot of good because those weeds aren't spreading by seed. And so the pre-emergent herbicides are really going to help you if you're dealing with things like spurge, crabgrass, these species that are spreading by seed. And so again, that's why it's important to identify those weeds before you go in and make those treatments. And I'm not going to get into identification, but there's a lot of great resources out there. And you can always send photos to me too to identify anything. But for those pre-emergent herbicides to work, 9 times out of 10, that weed needs to be spreading by seed. And so this is just an example of that. So nutsedge, Spectacle and SureGuard, they're not going to really control nutsedge, nor would they give you much control of Bermuda grass that's coming in from rhizomes. So. This was another trial that we did that was similar. This wasn't set up like an experiment like the last one. This is more of just a demo that we did for a field day. And then we had glyphosate alone, glufosinate alone, and then we combined those with either indaziflam, which was Spectacle, or prodiamine, which we used Barricade in this trial. And again, we saw the same thing where we reduced those annual applications. And in this case, because it was just a demonstration, we were just letting the weeds go up to 25% coverage, but still we reduced the number of applications quite a bit to where we're making less than 4 or less applications over the course of the year, keeping weeds basically 75% controlled, whereas opposed to we're making an application at least every month with, just using post-emergence herbicides. So selecting pre-emergence herbicides, um, uh, this is a list of some of the options that you have, and I have them color coded by mode of action. And so the main point that I want to give people with pre-emergence herbicides, not only can they can be used to reduce the total amount of herbicides that are used, but also don't just think that all these pre-emergence herbicides are going to control the same weeds. They're just like post-emergence herbicides, where some are going to be more effective on some weed species than others. People often see these and they think that pre-emergence herbicides they kill weeds as they germinate, and so one's just going to be just as good as the other, and that's not the case. You have to select these for the species that you're dealing with, just like you do post-emergence herbicides. Two that just came, I'll just mention these just real briefly. We do have two pre-emergence herbicides that came out relatively recently. Pethoxamid, which is sold as Stricor, which is a new option for broadleaf grass and sedge control suppression, and then SureGuard Extra, which they added pyroxasulfone to flumioxazin, which is what was the sole component of the typical SureGuard formulation. And so both of those are options. You could look into those if you're interested, but I just wanted to mention those as I'm giving an update. But here's some examples of pre-emergent herbicides, and definitely this isn't anything real scientific, and you won't see this type of slide from anybody but me really. But this is just how I think of things, and I'm using these as an example of the efficacy of these different pre-emergent herbicides. So the ones that are really effective on grasses I have here. A lot of these are your group three herbicides, and then the ones, if you're battling broadleaf weeds, I have some of those here. Now, there's definitely some crossover where some of these are going to control grasses and some of these are going to control some broadleaves, but generally, they're more effective on certain types of weeds or certain weed species than others. And so, when you're selecting those pre-emergent herbicides, look at the label information and read those recommendations and see what's the best option for the weed spectrum that you have. A lot of these can be applied over the top, like I've already talked about, where they have hundreds of plants on the label. So if the plants and landscapes that you're dealing with are on those labels, you can be pretty certain that you're not going to cause any injury if those herbicides are applied at the correct rate and at the correct timing. There's two that you can also use, the ones that we used in the study. Neither one of those can be applied over the top of any landscape plants, but they can be applied around the base of those woody ornamentals and things. So developing a rotation and a plan. So how many applications do you actually want to make a year? I've seen people have success doing anything from 1 to 4 pre-emergence applications per year. It just depends upon what their priorities are and how they want to structure their weed control program and a lot of other things. How good are cultural practices at those sites? Are the pre-emergent herbicides, do you want those to be a foundation, or do you just want to use them to reduce the total amount of, spot treatments and things that you have to do? What's the weed pressure like? That's a big question. What are the weed species that you're dealing with? Like I talked about before, if you have certain species, it might not even make sense to really focus a lot on pre-emergent herbicides. And then when are those pre-emergent herbicides going to be most advantageous? So a lot of times you'll see recommendations and you'll say pre-emergent herbicides, they go out from February to March, every year, and that's what you have to do to get your warm weeds. And that's true. I mean, that's a pretty good timing, to get a head start on those warm season weeds. But what if you don't have a big issue with the weeds, until you get into the rainy season? Well, it will make more sense to delay that application until the April, early May timeframe. There's nothing saying that you can't do that. And if that works better for your situation, by all means, delay that application. If you get one application per year and that's going to help you the best for a particular site, definitely go ahead and do that. we're going to get weeds germinating throughout the entire year in Florida. From January 1st to December 31st, pretty much Gainesville South, you're going to have these warm season weeds that can germinate just about all year round, in a lot of winters, especially when they're relatively mild. And so um, you can make those pre-emergent herbicides whenever it's best for your specific situation. You don't have to necessarily go based upon the timing. If you get it out early, say you made that application in early March, well, all that herbicide is going to be gone by the time you got into the rainy season anyway. So you could definitely make two applications or delay it until you needed it or do it however what works best for your situation. This is how to kind of think about it. So this is not a great example of a rotation, and so definitely don't take this. I give examples of rotations all the time. I tell people if you follow this, this could be devastating to to your business because these are all. I develop these when I'm giving recommendations to people. I develop them specifically for their specific situation, but this is how you want to think about it. And so, say you're making three applications per year you early spring, late spring, or early summer, and then in the fall. And so what you wanted to do, if you were making those three applications per year, two applications per year, or whatever, you want to think, okay, so what's my top, two or three species at this time of year? And so what's a good herbicide, a pre-emergent herbicide that I can use for those species? So early spring, you might be dealing with crabgrass, spurges, maybe even some cool season weeds like chickweed still at that time. So pick a herbicide that's effective for that. And then for the second application, getting more into summer, you might be getting into things like doveweed, stuff like that. So pick herbicide that's good for that, that's different from that first application, different mode of action, different active ingredient. And then the same thing for the third application. You're getting into fall. Um, a lot of them might be the same species, but think about what are those species? What's a herbicide that's going to be effective on this spectrum of weeds at this time of year? And then just wanted to go over some weed control and ground covers. With these, pre-emergence control is really important because all these ground covers, these non-turf ground covers, they're all broadleaf species. We can control grasses and sedges in these fairly easily. We have some options. Broadleaves and broadleaves, that's hard to do, is to selectively control a broadleaf and another broadleaf. And so oftentimes we need to focus on pre-emergence herbicides for those broadleaf weeds. For grassy weeds, we've screened a lot of those graminicides, fusilade, segment, envoy, ornament, a bunch of those. Those all generally seem to be very safe on things like perennial peanut, frog fruit, stuff like mimosa, stuff like that. Sedge herbicides, they've shown good tolerance in a lot of those ground covers too, like sedge hammer, dismiss. But you need to look, we can get injury with those, especially when we go higher on those rates, and it's very species specific. The number one combo for peanut that commercial applicators are using now is Basagran TO plus Fusilade. So they can control some broadleaf weeds, but mostly grasses and sedges with that. And so again, broadleaf weeds are the challenge. This is another thing that I want to mention too. So I was just able to do a really cool trial with our perennial peanut breeder up in Quincy, Florida, near Layton. And he got me 9 different cultivars of perennial peanut. And then so we've done some screening. We're working on that publication now. But these are the herbicides that we looked at: 2,4-D, Fusilade, Sedgehammer, Basagran, Plateau, Scepter, and then a non-treated control. So this is EcoTurf. This is a popular perennial peanut cultivar. And so people will look at perennial peanut or a lot of these different perennial peanuts, the main one, because there's different types that are out there in the market. But they'll look at that and they'll say, okay, so this, I used it on this lawn, had great success, and so this is safe on perennial peanut. There are different cultivars of perennial peanut that are out there. EcoTurf is probably the most common one that I've seen. But there's also other ones that could be potentially used depending upon where that person got it. Just like there's different cultivars of St. Augustine grass or zoysia grass or whatever, and some of those tolerances can be slightly different. And so that's an important distinction to know. And it can be very difficult to identify those different cultivars within perennial peanut and things, just like it's difficult to tell the difference between those different turf grass types. So look at the difference in golden glory tolerance to those herbicides versus the EcoTurf. EcoTurf, very minimal injury. You might use something, say you used a plateau, didn't get any injury, looked great. Then you go to the next lawn uh, and it's golden glory. Boom, you smoke that whole perennial peanut bed right there because it was a lot more sensitive. So some perennial peanuts are spread by rhizomes, some by stolons. Different cultivars that are out there, plants are different ages. So all these things can play into the safety and the tolerance of these different ground covers and these different species to tolerate herbicides. So very important to know this type of information up front and to be very hesitant when using a herbicide in a new site for the first time. I've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to be sure that we leave time for questions. So I'm just going to go over some non-chemical methods fairly briefly. A lot of this is dealing on mulch, and I've given several, entire webinars on mulch where I go deep into the details and things on different mulches and things. You can check those out. FFL, that website has a lot of great information on mulch. But just some things to discuss. So mulch, of course, is going to be the number one thing. Flame weeding, I always mention it because I'll get questions on it. That's definitely the most fun method of weed control is to control weeds with a blowtorch. It's really really fun to see those weeds burning. So solarization and stuff like that can work. It's typically not going to work on a commercial scale. Because if you're managing, a landscape professionally, you're likely not going to be able to leave something fallow and covered in plastic for 6 weeks. But for homeowners and things, it can be an effective method. But mulch is definitely the most common thing, most common way to control weeds, and it can be very effective as well. All mulch, if it's organic mulch, it can provide tons of different benefits in the landscape. But the different mulch types and things are going to work to control weeds a little differently. This is just the different ways that mulch can control weeds. Provides a physical barrier, reduces light because a lot of weed seeds need light to germinate. A lot of mulches, especially things like pine bark and pine straw, dry out very quickly after rainfall or irrigation. So weed seed lands on top, doesn't have enough moisture to germinate. And then allelopathy is something I get asked questions about all the time, but that's not really something that we've seen. We've tested different mulch types for allelochemicals. Um, don't really find anything. Most of these mulches that you use in the landscape, they've been aged for a while. So all those, any kind of allelochemical that might have existed is gone by the time it's actually being used. If you go up to 1 inch, you're definitely good in terms of reducing light. This was a study that we did where we looked at light levels under different mulch types. You just basically want that entire surface of the soil covered with that mulch. And generally, the recommendation is, something like 2 to 3 inches is going to be sufficient for weed control. Um, this is another thing to consider too when you're selecting mulch types. So with large nuggets and things, those can definitely be good. They'll often last longer in the landscape when you're talking about pine bark. Larger the particle is, the slower it's going to break down. But with those larger nuggets, you often have to go higher on the depth to get that complete coverage of the soil. So you see here, this is the same depths that were applied in terms of measuring it with a ruler, but you have tons of gaps with these large nuggets. And then if you have a mini nugget here, you go at the same depth and you get that good complete surface coverage. So that's an important thing to consider too when you're selecting mulch. The way that it's processed and milled and all those different things play a big role in how it's going to perform in a landscape. People will often ask, what's the best mulch type? And I say it doesn't really matter. It depends upon how it was processed. And this is what I'm talking about here. So this is a trial where we looked at different mulch types and how much water they hold. This is pine bark and pine straw that dried out very quickly after receiving 1 inch of rainfall. And then eucalyptus and melaleuca mulch. Both of those are good mulches to use, from just a mulch standpoint. But you can see that they're holding a lot more moisture because it's a more finely shredded wood. They're soaking up more water, and weed seeds are able to germinate on top of those in some cases. So just different things to consider. This is just particle size. I'm not going to go over that for sake of time. Um, so with those different mulch types and how they're processed, if those seeds are below the mulch, all of those work very well, regardless if they're hardwood, which in this case it was like a finely shredded wood where you had, it was one of those that held a lot more moisture. If the weed seeds were below that, they all worked great. No difference between that and pine bark or pine straw. It's when those seeds land on top of the mulch. Some of those, if the hardwood or whatever mulch that is can hold a lot of moisture, you can get weeds that start to germinate through that mulch layer, which is what we saw here. Seeds that landed on top of that hardwood mulch that contained all that moisture. Over time, it was no different than the non-treated check, whereas pine bark and pine straw still provided control because they were drying more quickly after rainfall or irrigation. And then this is a study that we did. So we saw, that those previous results, and so we did another one where we got them. We all basically hammer milled them to the same particle sizes, the same, so basically we're dealing with an apples to apples comparison with all these different mulch types. So this is as purchased with all these different mulch types, and you can see that the differences across the board in terms of how well they control weeds. When we equalize those, and we said, okay, they all have 25% small particles, 50%, large particles, et cetera, et cetera. They all perform the same. It's not the type, it's how they're processed. And so this kind of shows the same thing too. Seeds placed on top. So people will say, the herbicide is if you use combined herbicides with mulch, can that be done? Is the herbicide not binding to the mulch? And in some cases it is, but it can still provide weed control those weeds that are landing on top and germinating in that mulch. So in this case, this is 2 inches of pine bark nuggets with no herbicide, and this is 2 inches with herbicide, and then 1 inch of mulch with herbicide. You have some weeds that are going when that herbicide is landing on top of the mulch. A lot of that's intercepted by the mulch, but it's still active in controlling weeds of the control, providing control of those weed seeds that land on top of the mulch layer. I've shown this slide a bunch. This is just to show bark and straw, over time they're definitely, any mulch is probably going to compete just using a pre-emergence herbicide alone. That's not a sound way of controlling weeds. One application of mulch will outperform one application of any herbicide that's labeled for use in the landscape. So summary conclusions overall, just take a holistic approach. There's not any magic bullets. You don't want to rely too heavily on one method. Keep your options open. Know all the different tools that are available to you. Mulch type not as critical as depth and processing. So depth, I would say, is the big thing. Keeping that mulch at those adequate depths, those recommended depths. And herbicides combine with the mulch, but that can still improve control of weeds. And you can get away with a lot less herbicide use by doing that, by combining those together. And then pre or residual herbicides, yes, the general recommendation with those is going to be to do, a more treating a larger area because you're trying to prevent the weeds from becoming established in those cases. But the goal with those is really just to improve control and to reduce the total amount of herbicide that you're actually having to use throughout the year. So um, whenever you're trying to reduce costs or an environmental impact, always consider efficacy and how one thing that you do impacts everything else. And then proper maintenance reduces growth of all weeds. So The best, control against weeds is a good defense. That's watering properly, fertilizing properly, having mulch in place and applying that regularly to keep it up at adequate depths. And then increased communication with maintenance and pest control too. So if you're someone that does landscape maintenance, but you don't do pest control in terms of making the herbicide applications or vice versa, you're just making pest applications and you don't have any control over irrigation or mulch or fertilization or anything like that. It's good to communicate. There's not really a great way to facilitate that, but communicate that so that everybody can work together to give the best overall results and make everybody's life a lot easier. And so now I will open it up for any questions that anyone has. Hopefully, I didn't go too far over time, but
Thank you, Dr. Marble, for a wonderful presentation. We still have a few minutes for a question, and we do have a couple of questions here in the Q&A session. One of the first questions that we would like to address is a question from Kenneth. The question reads, what is the best herbicide to eradicate Wedelia other than glyphosate, which is banned?
the Wedelia is a tough one to control. There are a couple and it depends upon the situation. And so I get these types of questions a lot where they say, what's the best herbicide for this? Is it in a planting bed or is it a natural area? Is it in turf grass? I would need to know that type of information, but I would say send me an email, give me more details, marblesc@ufl.edu. And then I can also put you in contact with our Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, who have more invasive plant specialists and have more experience with Wedelia than I do probably. But it's a tough one to control. So.
Thank you so much. Um, just to add on, because it is the same theme, does adding diquat to glyphosate reduce the effectiveness of glyphosate?
Kind of a loaded question, really depends upon the situation. So, antagonism or reducing the efficacy has been shown with certain weed species in different sizes. It depends upon the rate of the diquat and the rate of the glyphosate and the weed species that you're dealing with. Really depends. A lot of people like it because it provides results much quicker. But if the diquat is mixed at any contact herbicide is mixed at too high of a rate, it can have antagonism in some cases. So,
Thank you so much. And then just shifting gears here, we have a question that reads, are there any tools that are out there that's great for identifying specific weeds so that way they can develop a control strategy for that identify weed?
yeah, so just for straight identification, the best resource that came out decades ago, and I still say it's the best resource, it's Weeds of Southern Turf Grasses. That's a field guide. It's got about 200 different pictures of weeds in it. That's great for, keeping in a truck or something like that to identify weeds. I have a website where you can just Google weeds by flower color, and it'll probably come up if you do that in my name where you can scroll through, a bunch of different weeds by flower color. I'd say, I used to, when I first started, I told people to stay away from the plant identification apps because they were wrong 9 out of 10 times. They are really good now. If you take a good photo and you feed it a good photo. And so I also have a guide on how to take good photos for plant identification apps. So read that, be able to take a good photo with none of the stuff in the background. People will take a picture of it in their turf grass, and it's going to tell you that the weed that you're dealing with is St. Augustine. But if you follow the instructions in that photo and take a picture of that weed in flower or fruit, oftentimes it will give you a good identification for that.
Thank you so much. We still have time for maybe one or two more questions. The next question is, when is the best time to use a pre-emergent for sand spurs, specifically in Central Florida, maybe Alachua County?
I typically see them late spring come up. maybe it depends upon where, and I'm not sure. I'm talking about Orlando, area. I'm in Apopka, so Alachua County. Depending upon what part of the county you're in, I imagine it's probably about the same, late spring, early summer. So generally, for that weed, whenever it starts to come up every year, trying to go maybe a month before you typically start to see it starting to emerge is a good timing for a lot of things. So that's kind of what I would generally aim for.
Thank you so much. So with that, that takes us to the end of the session today. We do have quite a few questions where people are asking for a copy of the slide. I would like just to remind everyone that this webinar is actually recorded. We will be posting this on our FFL channel, so please be mindful and access this webinar and future webinars, past webinars. They are going to be readily available for you to review at any given time. So with that, Dr. Marble, do you mind just sharing your contact information in case any of the participants would like to get in contact with you to address some questions or some points that were not addressed during a Q&A session?
Yeah, and my apologies. I usually put my email address at the end of my presentations, but my email is like my name, Marble, MARBLESC at UFL.edu. And so that's the best way to reach me, especially during the summer when I'm traveling a lot and in the field a lot and everything. But you can also, if you just Google Chris Marble UF IFAS, my contact information is going to come up. That's the easiest way to get in contact with me. You'll see my office number, and it actually forwards to my cell phone now, I believe, if I've got that app working correctly. But yeah, try email me. That's the best way to reach me, and I'll help you any way that I can. So.
Thank you so much. And just so everyone is aware, Rebecca was actually kind enough to post Dr. Marble's email in the chat. So if you had trouble following along verbally, it is posted in the chat, so you can just copy and paste it and make a note for yourself. So with that, thank you everyone for being a part of this professional webinar, and thank you to the guest speaker, Chris Marble, Dr. Chris Marble. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next session with Jamie. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.